Welcome to the Going Green podcast. Today we're going to have another look at electric vehicles. And basically, I'm looking at petrol prices becoming lower.
Which is good.
Yeah. The sort of 2030, is it somewhere around the bet there, isn't it? Deadline for stopping the manufacture of just pure petrol and diesel cars should be stopping.
Yes, it is. That's that. I mean, that's what the deadline is.
Yeah. And I suppose one of the questions we ought to think about asking now is, should you even now consider buying a petrol car in 2023? It's still got a few problems. If I know my mum's next door neighbour, he bought an electric car sort of about nearly 6 months ago. Still hasn't arrived.
But that's a different problem.
That's a different problem, yes. But the other problem is that if I want to buy a new electric car, I've got a long wait, yeah. And the second-hand market for electric vehicles is,
I wouldn't say it's great, but it's not exactly the most largest of markets.
no, it's not that big. And having seen some pictures over Christmas of people queuing up for a considerable amount of time just trying to recharge their cars, recharging opportunities are still a little bit limited. If you're just going to use your electric car for pootling around, not far from your home, then that's quite reasonable. But if you've got to do a long journey, electric vehicles are still a little bit of a challenge. So range is still a bit of a problem, especially with the cheaper cars.
Well, yes. Well, this is the problem with electric cars is the fact that they're running off batteries, and unfortunately, is you can go the distance if you have the batteries. The problem is, of course, is the fact that battery costs weight and they cost more money to make, and so you sort of. And then where are you going to put the batteries? Because, of course, you've got the mass of the batteries to deal with.
Yeah.
And so, you can have a car that will travel across, let's say, the whole of America. It will just have a whole trailer dedicated to a whole battery bank, as opposed to, think of a van as opposed to a...
Yes, there's no point in having a van if the entire van is actually full of battery and it's got no room to carry any cargo or possibly even any people. Range is a problem, but electric vehicle ownership's now approaching 5% of the market.
Yes,
and that's sort of a critical area, isn't it, really?
Well, the point about that is once it got going, essentially, then the incentive for people, like the car manufacturers, to make electric vehicles, to bring down the prices because more adopters will be going in, it was something daft. They did predict about 5% of the market. It's something about 4.1, sort of that sort of level at the moment, because it is the early adopters bring it in. We are now, once it's past 5%, you move from the early adopters to the more broad spectrum of people. It's one of those boring statistical graphs where it measures where it's sort of you have your early adopters and then you have basically your glorified more people buying into the system, and that actually creates more demand. So it's one of those lovely cycles or production cycles that say the more people buy it, the more people they want to make it. So there's that argument put forward to it, and it's one of those things where having more people use electric cars is actually making the world a better place.
It's certainly becoming greener, isn't it? You've got several ways of trying to look at this, but basically, if you've got electric vehicles, they're not polluting, and not necessarily polluting. Let's put it that way.
Well, yes. Whilst it's one of those things where you have to take a look at three measures of the electric vehicle. You've got to look at its production, its lifetime, and overall daily use. And so let's begin. The production of the a car, electric car, is actually quite bad for the environment. You know, we're thinking all the minerals and lithium, like how much cobalt is being used, and it's all the steel in making the car and those sorts of things. But that's all baked in. It's then moving across to it is over the lifetime. What we're seeing is, because we've now had electric vehicles for a long enough period, that which we knew would happen, is of course being a non-polluting vehicle. It's not polluting, which who would have known a non-polluting vehicle would not pollute? But it's actually in city places where people are placing in these low emission zones, much like what London has got and all sorts of places. And if people are finding that if I live there, I get exempt because I've got an electric vehicle. Well, then of course I want to get an electric vehicle because I'm exempt. That means I don't pay any money.
And this road fund basics at the moment, still, you can, you don't pay much for your road fund license, do you?
No.
How much do you pay for your road fund license for?
I think it's less than 1%.
It was free. I don't know if it still is.
On the electric vehicles, they got rid of the free, but it
is, but it's still not very much, because as more cars go on the market, then they still got to raise money for sort of things. So that's sort of, it's not that much.
As opposed to a normal car.
A petrol, diesel car, yes, which does cost us a lot. But also, I suppose, not only not making pollution, it also, if I go and have a look at my sort of atmosphere around here, what levels of pollution they're really quite high here. And by using vehicles like this, then things are set to lower, which is really good if you want to live, well, virtually anywhere in the world, isn't it? If you're going to cut down sort of pollution, we got rid of a lot of lead in petrol over the last few years. The last few lead producing country, forgotten which it is, one of the African countries that stopped only a couple of years ago.
Yes,
and so we should see a much more lead-free environment. It does take quite a few years for this to happen, but you've also got, as well as all those sort of things, other general pollution produced by petrol vehicles, which are generally, I know they've got catalytic converters, but the catalytic converters don't start working really until the car's warm. And how many of us on a cold morning nearly drive to work and the car's still not warm? And that means they're just chucking out loads of nitrogen oxides, which are not really pleasant to breathe in.
Well, no, they're not. But the point about if we move, or if we get an electric vehicle, or you move to an electric vehicle, you don't need to panic about if your car is cold or warm for the catalytic converter to work, because you don't have a catalytic converter.
Yeah.
Because you're not emitting any of these pollutions. So it's one of those dumb things where people say, pollution in regards to, say, emissions, then basically instead of having to try to clean up the pollution, the emissions, not producing them is the best form of cleanup or prevention, because of course then you're not having to spend money on the cleanup because you're not producing any. It's the prevention of the pollutants rather than the cleanup of the pollution.
I'm going to give you an interesting little thing, Paul, here on efficiency of cars. Let's look at the efficiency of a petrol vehicle. Pretty efficient, isn't it?
Well,
yeah?
It's one of those things where, it depends what you mean by efficient. This is
it's pretty low, actually. It's not very good. But the efficiency of a petrol or diesel vehicle actually increases in the winter. And it increases because when you've put the heater on, you're actually then sort of using more of that energy that you're using in the petrol for sort of driving the car, the waste heat is now turned into useful heat because it's keeping you warm.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Sure.
how about an electric vehicle then, Paul?
Well, unfortunately, an electric vehicle in that terms of efficiency is rather poor because, of course, there is no heat, so it has to generate the heat. And I'm not saying that electric motors produce a lot of heat because sometimes they can, but I'm not starting up, they don't. So, unfortunately, they are wasting a lot of energy. Well, it's one of those things where what the car does is not reuse, but recycles excess heat or excess energy into the car. Whereas, see, the electric vehicle, because it didn't produce that energy, is it?
So that you
Is more
basically you
efficient.
have to heat the car up.
Yes.
And of course, if you're heating the car up, that uses electricity. So electric vehicles are less efficient, and your range will go down if you want to put the heater on. I know a friend of mine was a very early adopter of electric vehicle, and she would go and visit her daughter in the nearby city, and coming back, she often had an option of either putting the windscreen wipers on or the lights.
Yes. Which is one of those hilarious things where,
It was a very little car. It was one of these gee whiz things, and as electric vehicles go, they're not the sort of things you really recommend as an electric vehicle, is it? It's like comparing a sort of Ferrari with a milk float.
yes, yeah. But it's one of those things where you ask this question of the charge and sort of using it. Would you say that the electric vehicle is actually more efficient because you're using only the energy required as opposed to having to recycle waste energy?
Yeah,
And that's the argument
yeah,
you say.
you're right.
Now there is a problem there because, of course, converting electrical energy into heat, we're not very good at the moment. That's the major innovation that needs to happen in those sorts of things. But we're not very good at doing that part. So, yeah, that's where new rounds of efficiency could be worked on. But
And of course, the other one thing they try and do is I look in. I've got a couple of cars. I've got a very old car, and I remember when it broke down, the rescue mechanic came along, and he wanted to plug his computer into my car, and I just said, "Good luck, mate." And he couldn't plug anything in because it didn't have anything to plug in to, and so he couldn't tell me what was wrong with the car. The more modern car does have one of those. But the point I'm going to now make is that most of these new modern electric cars also run basically a nice little computer in there.
yes, yes. Well, and even worse, they might run Windows.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you got four in the car, haven't you? Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're very
Yeah,
good.
okay. And so, yeah, they might run that. I really wouldn't like to try and rely on my car running Windows, judging by how much it breaks down. And that's just my computer going, I don't want to be going along at 70 miles an hour and suddenly get a blue screen of death.
No, yeah. This is the whole problem of the sort of letting a machine or a computer run your world. It's sort of, if it goes wrong, well, then suddenly, if your car goes wrong and it has to run through the thing, this is where we like to have analog switches for, say, the wipers, as in it's a closed circuit, as in, they can't, or your lights, it's an actual dial rather than having these lovely fancy switches or, yeah, yeah. Well, there's a whole realm of problems that way, but there is a world where mechanical switches are more useful than those are not for reliability. But it's one of those things where,
Well, I don't like the one where my car, sort of says, we'll switch the lights on because we think it's too dark. I go, yeah, okay, that's fair enough. And then sometimes I'm driving along and I think, I want the lights on. And it says, oh, it's too bright, mate. You can't have the lights on here. But fortunately, I do have a manual override. But I like to sort of take control when I'm driving. I'm not a very good passenger. Paul will tell horror stories of how good a passenger I am.
Yes.
Um,
But
it's not the screaming that puts people off.
no, it's not. But so inside, of course, your electric vehicle, you've got this lovely computer. But one of the major things is, of course, what is more, I say, problematic in the sort of the production of the car. Is it the car itself, or is it that tiny little computer that runs in it? And the answer is, unfortunately, in the sort of production and you do the emissions cost of the car, your tiny computer that lives in the car accounts for probably 50% of the overall car's emissions. And that's daft. Except then you look at sort of, oh, it's a silicon, it's a full-fledged computer, it's a silicon-based one. And of course,
They cost a lot of money
they
to
cost
make.
a lot of money to make. So you can sort of basically say, what in an electric vehicle costs is the motors, the battery, and the computer, and then silly things like the seats, the lights, the steering wheels, all those sort of things. Those are tuppence compared to the critical aspects of.
But it is the raw materials is a big problem with electric vehicles, and it's I suppose only a real problem because motor manufacturers, they're changing from petrol cars, which have one set of basically metals required, to an electric vehicle which requires a different set. You look at a petrol car, how much copper is required in that? And the answer is, well, yeah, some of the wiring, I suppose. But the electric car's got about the same amount of wiring, but it's got all this electric motor and all the windings on that, which are normally copper.
Yes, absolutely. And which is the whole realm of the sort of things where the manufacturing chains of electric vehicles, they do say that, things like copper, the price of a copper bar or copper ingot or whatever, he said, is set to skyrocket because of the demand of electric vehicles. It's really truly high at the moment because it's the demand for this. But it's not the demand in electric vehicles, I say, per se. It's
Demand everywhere.
the demand globally. It just happened to be with the more people buying electric cars, that their demand is going up and up and up to the point where it's equaling the demand of everybody else. So suddenly you've now got twofold demand of everything.
Yeah. But we are seeing the good news of these electric vehicles cutting what we call the lifetime greenhouse gas emissions, and they are being cut more or less in half. And that's quite good, really, because if I take a petrol car and I say it requires so much fossil fuel to run it a certain distance, and I take an electric car and we find that it does actually take slightly more fossil fuel to get it to go from A to B than the other car, yet as soon as you put in renewables into the mix of making the electricity, then that efficiency sort of starts to soar.
Yes, and the point about that is, say, traveling from A to B, you can measure the emissions from the petrol car, and typically the petrol cars are going to be remaining the same, or the overall. It's the same amount of petrol probably going to be burnt for the journeys, and that's no problem. Whereas, of course, the electric car not producing, you can say suddenly it's not producing anything in its journey time. You've only got to basically say how much it's in its production of the emissions that it produce. And so you're not adding this constant amount of extra emissions onto your vehicle, which is what's managing to say we now only need to account for the emissions produced in production, and that we can do with lots of other green technologies. As I said, you charge it by green renewables, then all the electricity's fine. So that's now a lifetime emission reduction. You make all the materials a bit more, you process them better or cleaner and greener. That reduces it, and then suddenly your lifetime emissions really goes down to the sort of minimum level. Not cut completely, in a sense, it can be pushed down as low as it can go without, say, basically saying, why don't you just hop on your bike? But the major point about that is you look at like I said, the petrol car, any fossil fuel car, is that because it's burning something, it's constantly outputting the same amount of emissions and fuel. So then it's sort of basically going, you're just adding a total up. So it's one of those things where you sort of say, is it the cumulative problem, or over the lifetime, how much you're going to do? So it is this cumulative versus lifetime emissions, and that's where the electric car is winning the battle hands down, because the petrol car just cannot keep up.
So we've got the manufacturing is the real problem, I suppose, really. It's the minerals that are required to do this. You were saying about cobalt required, and basically quite a lot of cobalt is still required into these cars. And the problem is where we get our cobalt from. 70% of our cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there are sort of lots of children working in those mines. And so people have to think about sort of being more responsible to, what they buy and how they buy it. People want the cheapest possible cars. When you go into a car, a car showroom, you say, oh, yes, I want this car. And you don't try and buy the most expensive car. Well, I certainly don't, and I don't know many people that do. What they're trying to do is get the cheapest car. And
or I wouldn't say necessarily the cheapest, but more bang for your buck one.
Yes, precisely.
It's the value of features and worth you're willing to put to it, as opposed to just some arbitrary number.
Yeah. So we've got these minerals that are being mined, and you've got to think about where are they being mined and how are they being mined.
But you've also got to remember that normal cars, they've still got these minerals to be mined. So, it's just the electric vehicle requires not rare ones, but unique ones instead of your...
Different, really, isn't it? Yeah. So instead of sort of some metals being required, other ones are. So we've got loads of lithium for the batteries, cobalt also going in there to sort of try and sort of fix the problem. So there are some sort of, if you like, unseen problems with electric vehicles that aren't necessarily sort of obvious. So by all means go for an electric vehicle, but then think about perhaps how it's made, and perhaps this is where efforts need to be put into different motor manufacturers to sort of produce, how would I put it, not more economically and environmentally friendly production systems.
Yes, and that's one of those things where you're looking at, that's where the changes need to be happening, by raising awareness of the problems, that you're basically saying, well, I will now only buy a car that isn't having cobalt produced made using children. And the answer is, if a lot of people get on board, and suddenly, that industry will basically change. And that's the pressure, consumer pressure that you people can do for it. But it's also in relation to other things that if we need these things, we want them to be cleaner and greener, then we're only willing to buy cleaner and greener things, then that's where the effort needs to go in and lie. It's not saying, yes, we're willing to buy a car or electric vehicle, no matter the economic value. Is that more finding out that it's a choice of, I could go and get this car, but it was, had to forced labour to produce it, or I could go for this slightly more expensive, where they actually paid the workers a decent wage. And if you select those, the economic truth of that means that the person selling the car for a cheaper wage suddenly says, well, I'm not getting that money, and so is it really worth me having the forced labour? And that's how systems of change and happens. And
it's happened in most industries, hasn't it, over the years?
over the years, yes.
So, last little thing to think about is basically as more electric vehicles hit the road, do our habits need to change of perhaps charging our vehicle and perhaps of driving our vehicle? The obvious place is let's charge at home. And if we are charging at home, then if you've got your solar panels and your sort of wind farm connected to your car, then you're sort of using a lot of sort of fossil free energy to sort of power your vehicle. But if you're going along the roads and you need to try and charge, then that can be a little bit more difficult. And you might be sort of finding that you're paying a lot of money for that, really, because, well, electricity is rising and it's set to rise more. And I can't really see it going down ever.
Well, no, it's hard to, unfortunately, put a plumb on that. But if the access to charging will help, and home charging is a way of doing that. It's one of the dumb things where if you have a small range of going to work, you want to charge it at home and then at work. But if you don't have one at work, then you want at least to get back to back home from work on one single charge. That's the
Yeah. The other problem, of course, are all these poor people who have an electric vehicle, but they don't and are not able to sort of park their car next to their house so they can charge it. And then they've got to use other means to try and charge their car, albeit sort of council places to try and charge them up, or, well, other places. And that can be sort of more expensive. It's also a case of when do you charge your car?
Well, yes, this is the whole.
Overnight is the answer.
Well, that's what most people say is the best time. Except, of course, it's one of those dumb things where in the night time, you see, you haven't got your solar panels working, so therefore, your renewable power for that's overnight is rather poor. This is why solar panels are not necessarily the way forward. But
but then if you've got solar panels, then perhaps charging your car on a nice sunny day is an excellent time to charge your vehicle, rather than your neighbours who might be using grid electricity might find for them the habit is better to do it at night time. So this is our basic habits may need to start changing. We've still got to see major investment in this charging sort of
economy,
idea. It's got to change. And there are other ways that we could actually do this. I've seen a system where the car drove into the charging station and somebody clipped a bolt, out came the batteries, in went a new fully set to charged batteries, and off they went. And that was very good. And the idea was that they charged these other batteries and put them into the cars. And it hasn't caught on.
Well, yeah, it's one of those things where it's hard to say that's going to.
Well, you can't, because every car is different. Well, every type of car.
Yeah, so it's hard to push that message, but maybe we will see this. But it's the problem of sort of batteries are expensive and heavy to produce. So, you can't really say which way's forward or which way's better.
And problem is also buying an electric vehicle. The electric vehicle is probably going to last quite a few years, but the batteries won't. And so some people sort of rent their batteries. And so when they've seen it finished, their sort of lifetime, they can actually be intelligently recycled. And we can recycle. It's just that it's sometimes quite expensive to do so.
Yeah, and that's just a volume of scale. You see, if everybody's recycling, it'd be quite cheap. So,
yeah,
it's one of those things.
You've been listening to the Going Green podcast, looking at an update on electric vehicles. Should you buy one yet? That's the question that we really should have asked. And the answer to that one, I still feel, is I can't afford one.
Well, yeah, the answer is yes, you should do, but unfortunately, if you can't afford it, then you can't afford it. It's
It will get better as time goes by.
yes.
So thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next one. Until then, bye-bye from me.
And a goodbye from me.
Bye.